So, welcome to the show, Jhaynane. I am so grateful to have you here to talk to us a little bit today. I would love to start out, if you would, by just telling us a little bit about um, yourself and what put you on the path that you're on today.
Oh, that's a big question, but I'll try to dumb it down a little bit, water it down. So my entire life, I grew up in a very spiritual household. It's been very spiritual all the time. But there's always traumas that happen, regardless how well intentioned your parents are. And my mother, although she was well intentioned, she still had some issues to work out. And so when I was 12 years old, I started to gain weight. And my mother made those little comments about, maybe you shouldn't eat that, or don't do this, don't do that. So I developed an eating disorder. And that carried on for at least 15 years, 10 to 15 years. And I wanted to get help. And is I have to do things on my own to figure out things on my own before I do anything else. So I graduated from college and I was like, I'm not really doing much with my life. Let me learn more about nutrition. So I wanted to get my master's in nutrition to help myself out. And it did help me out a whole lot. But as I was in my nutrition field, I was like, there were some disconnections. There's disconnections about emotions and calories and just everything. And to me, once I took this class about wellness and psychology, that's when everything started to make sense. Like a lot of my issues were related to my emotions. And so I was like, forget thinking about calories. Let's focus about the emotion component. And that's when everything opened up. Everything from learning about Reiki, because about energy healing, about breath work. And I just decided to put these all things together because, again, I do things for myself first. So I'm my own guinea pig. And it felt so good for me. And I just want to share this with the world. So that's how I got things started.
Beautiful. Yeah, I do trauma recovery coaching, and I find and have learned through many years of working with women who have experienced trauma. And usually, I'd say 95% of trauma does occur in childhood.
Mhm. Yes.
But one thing I've learned is these things like eating disorders, for one, are very common with people who've experienced all types of trauma. But these types of self-sabotaging behavior, if you will, we can begin to work on those issues, of course, but until we get to those deeper root core issues, those things I find will just be manifested in another form, another way, or we just can't break the cycle we're in. So I think that's amazing when you said, I realized there was still disconnect. I needed to deal with the emotions and basically deal with that root cause and those root cores. So amazing work. I mean, for using yourself as a guinea pig, I guess. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, but if you want to expand a little bit more on kind of what your personal story is with having a eating disorder while being a woman of color.
Yeah, it's something that was never talked about. Like I didn't understand what was going on with me. What I thought was I just like to eat. I talked horribly to myself. I would say I was a fat pig. I was ugly. No one will love me.
Mm.
And everybody around me is like, why don't you just go on a diet? Try this diet, try that. Not understanding that they're making things worse. And I also use food as a way to rebel against my mom because to me, telling me that I'm fat, I'm like, okay, you want to see I'm fat? I'll show you how fat I was going to get. But it's something that we don't talk about. And I know many women of color are suffering in silence because they don't know what's going on. It's not until I went into my master's program and I started doing some research about eating disorders. And I was like typing, I'm like, okay, well, I'm Black. Let me find things about Black people and see what is eating disorders being a Black woman. I couldn't find anything.
Mm.
All the information I could find was comparing Black women to white women. And all the results was saying Black women are least likely to have eating disorders compared to white women.
Mm.
So their conclusion was Black women don't have eating disorders. And I'm sitting here like, this is some BS. Because I know so many Black women who have all these traits. They may not call it an eating disorder, but when I'm looking at you, I'm like, there's something up with you. So as I was doing more research, you could see how it's tainted. And I'll say it in white supremacy. And I was like, this is effed up. And it's not until recently, maybe a couple of years, that they finally have done research that states that at least Black teen girls are 50% more likely to have an eating disorder than their white counterparts. And this is, I think, 2019. So for all these years, it was labeled a white woman disease, and having all these women of color suffering in silence because they weren't doing the proper research. And when it comes to all these studies, the way they test determines what the outcome is, and they weren't doing the proper testing. So it's kind of infuriating that you have all these women who think that, oh, I must be fine, or I just eat a lot, or I restrict my eating, but it's not a big deal because the doctor doesn't think I have an issue, but it's only because of their color of their skin.
Mhm.
That's it.
So that's kind of crazy. Where do you think that disconnect happened, and why and how? I mean, that is pretty insane to think that it was just being said that Black women or women of color just don't have eating disorders. So where do you kind of think that all stemmed from? Or why was there such a lack of research and information?
Well, several things. I think that the medical field or nutrition field has a bias towards Black individuals, but also they think a lot of stereotypes are used because in the Black community, yes, we tend to be curvier. We tend to like curvier women, right? And they would use that as, oh, because they are heavier or they tend to like heavier people, they're immune to wanting to be skinny. But they don't understand that through assimilation, many Black women are trying to fit into Eurocentric ideal standards of beauties, and they don't see that part. They just see the numbers. But they also don't realize that a lot of Black women suffer from binge eating disorder and from bulimia, but instead of being skinny, they might be larger. So it's just they're not paying attention,
Mhm.
or they're choosing not to see the signs because it does not apply to the greater society, I guess.
Yeah. And I think you made a good point in saying, when we think about eating disorders, we associate it with really skinny, kind of sucked up looking women where it's really noticeable. But I think you make a really valid point in saying sometimes that looks like being actually heavier or overweight. And so I think that's something that kind of put the light bulb on for me because we don't really associate those two things.
And to be honest, women who suffer from eating disorders actually tend to have normal weight.
Really, that's
So
really
you won't even notice because they suffer from binging and purging.
Mhm.
So from bulimia, so a lot of times kind of even kills the weight out. So people won't notice, because if you see somebody with anorexia, you can kind of tell there's something going on there because it's very blatant. And if it's like binge eating, I mean, there's lots of overweight individuals in the United States, so you may not really blink an eye. But in the middle, for the binging and purging, that's a lot of people there that may be normal weight or they might be fit.
Hmm.
And you don't realize that behind closed doors, they're hurting themselves because they're not tapping into their emotions, and they are choosing to do this as a way to either comfort themselves because they don't have a way to comfort themselves, or they're using this as a way to control their life because everything in their life seems to be out of their control.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And also, again, really eye-opening to realize that a lot of people don't look on the surface as if they're suffering with this. And also, I think just a reminder for everyone as well, just to remember that we don't really know the inner workings, and we don't always wear these things for everyone to be able to view them, right? And I think an invitation to show up in general with more compassion and understanding, realizing that there's a lot we don't know that's going on with each individual we come across. That's really, really interesting. So, how would you say the system has failed you and other women of color?
So I'll use a little story of mine. So I'm from the East Coast and I moved to San Diego quite a while ago. I'm back on the East Coast. But in my time in San Diego, I went to go see a therapist because I was suffering from depression. And I knew I was having issues with my eating. So I went to see him. And towards the end of our session, he tells me, I don't know how they do it on the East Coast, but on this coast, you have to go work out and eat well. And I was like, excuse me? Like, I work out, I'm doing the best that I can. But he was like emphasizing that I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing in order to fit their beauty standards. And that stayed with me. I'm 33 now, so that's a good 7 to 8 years for this long. Cause I'm like, what the hell? Like, how dare you speak to me in that fashion? Like, do you know what you could be doing to people? So, even when it comes to women of color reaching out for help and going to these providers and they tell them some effed up things like this, it makes them not want to go. And for a woman of color to even go reach out for a mental health service is huge because in our communities, we don't do that.
Mhm.
That's frowned upon. That's like a no-no. So that's a huge step for even going to therapy. And the therapist like, oh no, girl, go work out, go diet, do something. You're too fat. No, that makes you not want to reach out for these services. So to me, I'm like, at least for myself, I'm like, you ain't the one. I'm gonna go find somebody else better. But that's me. Somebody else could have been like, okay, well, I don't want to ever go back at all. So I think there's a lot of training to be done in these fields to understand, to see the patterns and to like check their biases. Because there's a lot of fat shaming, like check your biases. I know we're all human, but if you're working with individuals, you have to understand that it's more than what the eyes can see. You have to be more empathetic and compassionate towards others.
Definitely. So true. So I teach a certification class where I teach other women and certify them to becoming trauma care specialists. And the first class we cover is ethics. And that's one of the first things is we explore our bias, because let's face it, like regardless, we all do have them.
Mhm.
And a lot of times stemming from trauma. And a lot of people who are interested in doing trauma work are interested because of their own trauma. But I think that's a great point you bring up. And it's something that I also teach, is that we have to have a lot of awareness if we're going to stand in these positions of our own bias, and either be willing to heal those bias or realize that we're not healed enough in that area, and then refer someone to someone else who can help them so that they aren't left feeling in many of these ways that you just described that you felt, kind of judged, um, and not really having the help you need. So I think that's so important when you say we all need to check our biases, right? And I think
Yes.
just whether we're doing this work or moving through the world, it's important that we at least have awareness around what our biases are and where did they form and why do we have them, and can they be healed? What are we doing, etc. So I think that is such an amazing point to be made. What would you say, or more so, how can women of color recognize that they need healing despite medical gaslighting? And can you just talk a little bit more about medical gaslighting and women of color?
I mean, all women, this is not all lives matter, but I'm making it all women matter. We all need healing. Okay. We all need healing. I don't care who you are, how great your childhood was. There's always work to be done. And if you come to me like, I'm good, no, you're not. that means you're in denial of something. So for women of color, that is a deep rooted question, because it's been generations upon generations of medical gaslighting, and there is a lack of trust when it comes to our community and the medical community, for obvious reasons, for like, unwanted medical testing, to tying our tubes without our consent. So I would say to go to people that makes you feel safe. And if it's going to another woman of color, then go to another woman of color, because there are Black therapists out there. There are Latinx women that are in therapy out there. They do exist. They don't have to all be a white male or white woman. And I'm not saying they can't help you. The person who helped me was a white male. So there's people, but you have to go with who you trust. And if somebody tells you, oh no, you're fine, or this is all in your head, then forget them, find somebody else. And I know it can be difficult depending on your insurance. Let's be honest here, the system is so imperfect. But if you can, try somebody else, because you don't want to stay in a situation when no one's listening to you and your health and your mental health is deteriorating. You have to be your own advocate, or find somebody to advocate for you. That's the most important thing, because we're here to heal. We're here to heal, especially with all the traumas, especially in our DNA. It's like there's a lot of things to be unpacked. So if you're out here thinking, oh, I tried it once, try it again. Try it again until you find the one.
I love that. I love that advice. That's great advice. Can you talk a little bit more about generational trauma and how it has affected women of color? You kind of touched on that, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So, scientifically speaking, trauma actually can come from our ancestors. It lives within our mitochondrial cells. So, for women of color who it could be Native women from the Trail of Tears, to Black women from slavery, from all of that, that trauma from your ancestors lives within you. And depending on what happens to you epigenetically, it might get triggered and it might start manifesting within you, right? And not only that, but if you're going to go way closer to your family tree, your mother's traumas, if they're unresolved, she's going to project that onto you. Same thing with your father. His traumas, if he does not heal those, they're going to project that into you, whether they do it purposely or not, right? So all of that is like a mixture of your own personal traumas, your ancestral trauma, and your parental trauma, all combined onto you. So it's a lot. It's a heavy burden to bear. So that's what I'm saying. Everybody has trauma. That's why I say it. And when you are ready to take the steps to your healing, you'll start to notice a lot of your behaviors or your thoughts or your beliefs are not actually yours. They're the projections of others, and you, probably stemming from childhood, believed it because you heard it so many times. So when you start the healing process, you'll be able to like unpack, unload these things and rediscover who you actually are. And you're like, oh my God, I thought that was me. It wasn't. And I feel so good. So that's why I always advocate, get the healing done. Get it done, because it's going to change your life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When we start really confronting those conditioned beliefs and thinking that we hold, it's quite shocking to realize, oh, we have been holding on to so much that really is not ours. And I love that you bring up the epigenetics. That's such a fascinating study right now, field of study for me right now, and just seeing how those DNA becomes activated. And sometimes it will be at the same age as someone in our lineage who experienced trauma. Sometimes it will be activated from a similar experience, but it really is fascinating to see that not only are we passing things down through projection, as you mentioned, but some of it is literally stored at a cellular level. So I definitely think it's so empowering when we're able to define and get clarity around what is mine and what is not mine, and being able to finally release. And that's really how we begin to break those cycles, right? That's how we begin to end those generational cycles and heal our lineage. And it's amazing because we often think of healing our lineage as healing starting with us and then healing downward from us. But what I've learned is that we actually heal in both directions when we begin that and breaking those cycles. We heal and do the healing for all those that came before us as well. And it's giving me chills because it's just such a beautiful process. I just love it. But I love that we touched on that for sure. So before we kind of end for today, before you leave, could you share a few last words of wisdom with my listeners today? Anything you feel called, or anything that you feel just comes to you that you think is someone may need to hear?
Take your time when it comes to healing, because I know we want to reach that finish line, but to be honest, there's no real finish line. It's a process. And as you get deeper into it, you'll find so much beauty within the healing. At first, it's going to be quite challenging and difficult. And yeah, there'll be some ugly tears, some screams, some whatever, maybe even anger. But allow yourself to go through the emotions. Don't try to circumvent them. Because once you go through the darkness, that's when you're able to see there's a wisdom within each trauma that you have. And a lot of people don't believe me when I say it, but there is a wisdom and there are lessons. And it's not about forgiving the actions of others. It's about seeing how this affected me and how it molded me to be the person that I am today, and to how it helped me to be the person I'm going to be, which is a beautiful soul. So take your time with it and just really enjoy it. I know it's crazy to enjoy healing, but I think that if you change your mindset and not see it as a burden, but as an opportunity to grow, that's when you're able to really enjoy the process.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then one last thing, where can my lovely listeners go to find out more about you, or if they would like to work with you or just generally connect with you? Where's the best place for them to go to do that?
I would say either on Instagram at moonlotus.co, even on TikTok at moonlotusco, or if you want to go directly to me, you could hit me up on my website at moonlotusco.com.
Perfect. And as always, I will have those links available for my listeners down in the box to make it really easy to find you. And I really want to thank you for sharing so much of your story with us today, for showing up so vulnerable, and just for being here and sharing this space with me. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me.